Hello, today's video will be on the infamous 7 Years' War, the real First World War. While most schools in America gloss over the so-called French and Indian War to save more time for the glorious American Revolution, I personally find the 7 Years' War to be much more interesting. I mean, it's a world war with British and French going at it all over the continents. I mean, doesn't that sound much better than a small rebellion in the American colonies? The 7 Years' War started as a border dispute between the French and the British in the Ohio River Valley. This was very fertile land and technically claimed by both countries, so it was understandable why they wanted to fight for it. The British, not wanting to negotiate with the French, decided to send out Major George Washington and his Virginia militia to build Fort Necessity on French territory. The French did not like this and sent troops to go take the fort. Even though fighting occurred for 2 years, 1754 and 1755, real war started in 1756 when the French decided to take some random islands in the Mediterranean from the British. In Europe, the British King George II knew that the Anglo-German state of Hanover was at risk to an attack by the French. Because of this, he chose to align Britain with the King Frederick II of Prussia. Frederick was very ambitious, which made a lot of enemies for Prussia. The French took advantage of this and convinced the Austrians, Russians, and Swedes to go to war with Prussia. Looking for new territory, Frederick invaded the French and Austrian ally of Saxony. The invasion was a success, but the army lacked momentum and was unable to take Prague in Bohemia. Prussia's first major victory came during this campaign, in a fight with the Austrians at Leutenburg. Though Frederick was outnumbered and outgunned, he decided to move his troops in the middle of the night to the Austrian and Saxon and French right to outflank them. In the morning, when the charge came, the Saxons were completely surprised and the Austrian line collapsed, giving the battle to Frederick. While the Prussians, Austrians, and Saxons fought in Europe, the British focused their sights on New France. The idea was to have a three-pronged attack to take Fort Duquesne, Louisbourg, and Acadia. These campaigns were mostly disasters and only one succeeded, the attack on Acadia. The march to Fort Duquesne was especially bloody for the British because the general in command, General Braddock, was unaware of North American fighting style and his men were massacred by the native populations. With the Canadian and New French militias taking up British time in the Americas, the French were able to gather their forces to send them to Quebec along with one of the greatest French generals, Marquis de Montcalm, who had successfully defended Prague in the War of Austrian Succession. Montcalm saw the Hudson River as the highway that would lead to New York and marched troops down to take Fort William Henry. His first attack in 1755 was a failure. However, after he returned in bulk with more troops, he was able to siege Fort William Henry and force the British occupants back to Albany. Meanwhile, in Europe, things were not looking well for Prussia, as its enemies had finally gathered their forces. The massive Russian army was in East Prussia in Kaliningrad and marching west towards other Prussian coastal fortresses, where they teamed up with the Swedes to help fight the Pomeranian War in northern Prussia. In the south, things were not looking good either, for the Austrians had mostly removed the Prussians from Saxony and had retaken Silesia and were marching north. Things were looking so bad for Prussia that in fact for a little while the Russians and Swedes held Berlin. The Prussians eventually took it back, but it was just another back and forth that lost many lives for Prussia. Seeing that the Prussians could not help them, the French then decided to send another army to take Hanover and defeat the British army. The French marched into Hanover and took the fortress city of Minden and set up camp around there. The Hanoverians and British then decided to siege the city. The French, with their supply lines cut off, eventually decided to attack the British on the plains outside of Minden. The French attack was strong but split up by Hanoverian and British cavalry, and the large army was forced to surrender, destroying the French campaign in Hanover. In 1758, William Pitt became leader of the English Parliament, and he had a war strategy of focusing on the Americas. Hundreds of thousands of British troops were shipped to North America to siege French forts such as Fort Duquesne, Fort Niagara, Fort Frontenac, and Fort Ticonderoga, then known as Fort Carillon. At the battle for Fort Carillon, the French leader Montcalm set up his defenses on hills northwest of the fort. Unfortunately for the British, by the time they had arrived there, their master strategist, General Abercrombie, had died. Because of this, the British were not able to plan a well-coordinated attack, and even though they had superior numbers, the French won the day. Even though the French could not hold Fort Carillon, and it would fall a year later, it was still a great boost in morale for the French army. With General Abercrombie dead, General Wolfe was placed in charge of the Americas for the British. The first step in Wolfe's plan for taking New France was the seizing of the coastal fort of Louisbourg and using that as a jumping-off point to take Quebec. Louisbourg was captured, and Wolfe moved up the St. Lawrence River to take Quebec. Wolfe set up camp on an island west of Quebec and south of Beauport. Anticipating that Beauport would be where the attack would be, Montcalm set up his camp there. Wolfe started with an attack on Beauport, which, because of the high cliffs there, he was unable to send his forces to take the city. Wolfe then decided that in the middle of the night he would sail his troops upriver, south of the Plains of Abraham, to unload his troops. In the morning, when Montcalm had figured out what had happened, it was too late. He rushed his French regulars outside of the city to meet up with the Quebec militia. Even though they had superior numbers, the French were unable to defeat the trained British regulars, and even though both Montcalm and Wolfe died, the city was taken for King George II of Britain. William Pitt continued his strategy of war in the colonies and had the British soldiers take Montreal and later defeat the French and their Mughal allies in India, allowing for British colonization in later centuries. In Europe, things were looking up for Prussia, as the Tsar of Russia had died, and the new one, Peter, was from Holstein and an admirer of Frederick the Great. He then pulled Russia out of the war, and Sweden, being allied with Russia, eventually decided to leave the war as well, letting Prussia focus its forces on Austria. With the war on land going to the British, the French then decided that perhaps they could defeat them using superior naval power and built up their navy. In response, the British greatly increased the size of their navy, and it became a naval arms race. Sea battles occurred all over the world, especially off the shores of Canada, France, Spain, India, the West Indies, and West Africa. Around this time, the Spanish decided to enter the war on the side of the French because their king was part of the same Bourbon dynasty that Louis XVI was a part of. The Spanish invaded the British ally of Portugal, however, their army was racked with disease, and the Portuguese were able to defeat them in a matter of weeks without fighting a major battle. This is why the 7 Years' War is called the Fantastic War in Portugal. Even with the new ally of Spain, the French could not defeat the British in terms of sea power. The British had more money, more ships, and a superior blockader on the French coast. Therefore, in 1763, the French were forced to sue for peace, and the Treaty of Paris, the treaty ending the war, was signed. In the treaty, all French holdings in North America and India were given to the British, except for Louisiana, which was handed over to the Spanish for being such a good ally, I guess. After the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the British refused to send more money and guns to the Prussians, stopping their funding for the war against Austria. This angered the Prussians and caused them to side with the colonists during the American Revolution 10 years later. However, without funds from Britain, the Prussians could no longer go on fighting and were forced to sign a peace treaty with Austria, finally ending the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War has had a great impact on the world today, the main reason being that William Pitt, considering that a lot of money went to help the British colonists defeat the French, believed that the British colonists should then pay most of the taxes to pay off the war. This, of course, angered the Americans, who led a revolution in 1776. Also, the absence of French and Spanish settlements in India led the British to be able to colonize the continent in the coming decades. Lastly, this war solidified British naval power for the next 2 centuries. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, comment, and subscribe.